All right, so let's start off by talking about open economics, yeah?
Yeah, let's talk about common wisdom. We're going to talk about that article. It's kind of a throwback to the beginning of class, so we should all be very well versed in open source software, even throughout some GNU project information in here. One of the interesting things I thought about this article, the premise of the article talked about textbooks, and one of the questions was, why not have at least the content be crowdsourced? It talked about Wikipedia and standing on the shoulders of giants. And one of the interesting points was that it doesn't cost Tolstoy less to distribute a digital copy to 1 million people versus one person. What do you guys think about that?
I think it makes a lot of sense. I think content is so simple, and so it's so easy at this point to share it. It just makes sense to put it up on Wikipedia or somewhere, so that we don't all have to write this same content over and over and over again, or have 50 different history books on American history like that are pretty much all the same.
As a former history teacher, let me just jump in there and say the words Civil War. Now, there are two very big schools on Civil War, and trying to create common assessments in history teaching that dealt with the Civil War was like near impossible, simply because people could not agree on whether or not the Civil War was an issue of states' rights or slavery. Yeah, so I think you get the idea. So I think that's one thing. But so here's something else to think about. So Tolstoy, he wrote this massive book, and it took him a long time, and that was his livelihood. Now, he's dead and gone. Or even if he was rich now, then sure, that makes sense to, just put it out there so everyone can experience it. But playing the devil's advocate here, if I spent, 500 hours writing a textbook, that's a lot of time. I need to feed my family. If I had one, I would need to feed them. And so if that is, how do I say, if that's time is something that I should have been using to make money to feed myself and my family, then that's an issue. Now, if that's something I've done on my own, that's a whole other issue. That's, not a concern. So just to throw that idea in there.
Yeah, you bring up some really good points, Dan, and actually Benkler addresses that in this article. The cost reduction of putting all of this content out there in the open sphere, whatever you want to call it. Once the reduction of cost is out there, the cost of participation is lowered. If there's a place to put it, Wikipedia, for example, the cost to be able to participate in this volunteer act of adding to the repository or the common wisdom repository, the question of motivation comes in. So we're not actually talking about feeding your family or doing the work or something like that, even though Tolstoy was the example that I used.
Exactly.
People can kind of in their spare time, so that gap time between the time from you come home from work, you've already done your day job, you're putting food on the table for your family, you've got some time, and you get to decide and you get to do a cost-benefit analysis of what you do with those extra hours after your day job. And if you decide that you want to contribute to the common good of mankind by putting your version of revisionist history and deciding who won the Civil War, then you can do that with 5 minutes or 15 minutes or 3 hours if you want to. And there are actually some really fascinating examples in here of people who have done entire textbooks. Like there's been one contributor, and they've done a whole textbook. And then there are other examples of textbooks that have had hundreds of contributors. So I think it shows a dichotomy of one person to do it or hundreds of people can get together and do it, and crowdsource it. And both examples work equally well.
But I think you run into problems when you only have one person contributing to the book, because then you get that one kind of skewed view or biased view rather than 20 people collectively their biases, right? And they can kind of counteract that. And a teacher that I worked with that was using an open textbook didn't like it because it was written by one person and it had all of her biases in it. Whereas if you have a book written by 20 people or collaborated on, I think that reduces the amount. Because you have a more collective approach to the topic, I think you wouldn't alienate as many people with that, with your view with that book.
You can alienate all of them.
Well, so in that vein, I think that can be one of the major strengths of open textbooks. Usually what we have is a book with a set of information or biases that are approved by whoever produced the book, the publisher, whoever. But I was just thinking, like with a history book, you could have a whole bunch of little modules or something about the Civil War from a whole bunch of viewpoints, which could be really cool. Because I was a history major too, and I think outside of the study of history, you like to think, well, this is what happened, but that's not really how it is. You know, this is one person's view of what happened, and you can have 10 people's view if you wanted an open textbook, and that would be so cool.
That would actually be really a lot more relevant than only having one person's view. Now, I'm not a history major, but I am married to one, so I just want to feel cool. But what a great way to present content, to present it from alternate viewpoints instead of just one person's viewpoint. I think that's a great way to look at it.
But then one chapter would balloon to 8 chapters.
Yeah, we don't care about that.
No. Well, so one thing you could do, you could have all of those available and the teacher could pick. Or you can have all of those available and the teacher could pick 2 and put them in the
students could pick.
Or the students could pick. That could be really interesting. That's something that some of our professors do. Everybody gets a textbook and you sort of teach each other. And you could do that. Every student could read a different viewpoint of whatever event it was, or you could put them in groups, 3 or 4 groups of students reading the same viewpoint, you know. And they could all kind of bring that to the table in class.
That's a really interesting idea, because I think you learn the most when you have to like defend your ideas or defend why this is this way, and kind of have that debate back and forth.
Yeah. And I think what we do now, even with the flipped classroom, is we all read this thing and then we all come and we're really susceptible to groupthink and the biases of the chapter that we've already read. And so we're sort of, in some ways, we're limited by the tyranny of these textbooks. But if it was more flexible, then we could bring more possibilities in. We wouldn't be limiting students right off the bat.
So I'll throw out another idea then. We already have Wikipedia that has all these articles on all these topics. And as we've seen, you could actually make a book from Wikipedia just by going through and with the book feature and selecting various articles and putting them into a book. So we could create an open textbook just like that. The problem, of course, becomes the pedagogy that's not embedded in that content. So how do we make sure that there's pedagogy embedded in that content with this crowdsourced product?
See, I think that I don't think that's the right way to think, because then you're having the content drive the pedagogy when the pedagogy should drive the content.
Exactly.
So you should say, "This is what I want to teach you," and then go get that go get that content. I would say.
But at the same time, we can't really expect teachers to be teachers and instructional designers and everything else they have to be necessarily.
Well, you don't have to be an instructional designer to know good teaching pedagogy.
That's true. That's true.
You have to know good design skills to be a designer, and you have to know good pedagogy to be a good teacher, I think.
So I like the thing that David suggested in class, that we have this little triangle of a learning outcome and some content and an assessment. That was the 3 things, right? Where
yeah.
Packaged together like that in a ready to teach kind of way. Because we had a smallish kind of side conversation, because I feel like in a lot of ways we have a lot of available content. Like, I've never tried to look something up that was just, like, factual that wasn't on Wikipedia. I'm sure there are things that I haven't tried to look up, But but there's so much content out there, and information does not seem to be the problem. I think it's like David was saying, information that is ready to be taught.
The packaging of the information.
Yeah, the tone and the writing and the horrible dryness of Wikipedia. Right?
Versus the comics.
The lack of comics. Yes, many problems. The lack of boxes.
Right. Well, and that brings up a really good point, and that's one of the things that Benkler touches on in the article, is that it's the filtering and accreditation in the universe of the objects. That could be one of the jobs of pure production, right? It's the creation is really a problem. There's lots of people are creating stuff and tossing it out there. It goes in Wikipedia, and the job of the Wikipedians is to kind of diffuse it of all personality. It's devoid of personality, and that's the point of it, right? You suck it dry and you present it on Wikipedia as neutral, and that's what it's supposed to be. What if there were a repository where it wasn't like that, and then it became curation, and it could be peer rated and peer reviewed, and OER Commons does a good job of that. There are places where that is happening. How do we get it to be the Wikipedia of learning objects, or the Wikipedia of content, where people can go? That's the question, and that has not happened yet. What's the springboard, the catalyst that can get that to happen?
Well, I think the tool that exists on Wikipedia, if you could embed that tool in not Creative Commons. Is it Creative Commons?
OER Commons.
Yeah.
OER Commons.
OER Commons. If you could embed that into OER Commons, so you could pull all these different things and create a textbook or create a chapter, I think that's because the way when he showed us the Wikipedia Make a Book feature, I was like, that is so easy. Like, I could curate my own material that way and develop my own textbook very, very easily. And I think it's in small enough chunks. If you could break it down even more and you had more flexibility to break down the different chunks, I think a tool like that would be hugely beneficial.
Like Wix.
Like Wix.
Yeah.
The Wix version of textbooks.
Right. Does OER Commons have options like that, or is it just a big repository?
Well, it's a repository, and there's a rating system on it, and you can take pieces and use it, but I think it's largely digital, and you can put it in your own learning management system. So I'm not sure that there's a print functionality to it, or a printable textbook version. I'll have to check on that, though. I'll report back at our next online rendezvous.
Great.
So we should probably move on.
We should probably hop over to sharing nicely, if everybody's okay with that.
Sure.
Yep.
Okay. So I'll give a little overview of sharing nicely. It's very about open, obviously, but less about instruction. But I think that there are some principles we can take away from it. So he talks about how shareable goods are kind of the topic of this article, and shareable goods are lumpy. I love that term, lumpy. The first time I was thinking like poorly made wheat, and it was like, what is happening in my class? But lumpy means you have to buy a certain amount, whether you need that whole amount or not. And so I kind of he had a metaphor of carpooling, which really resonated with me for some reason. I don't carpool, I don't know why, but so you have to buy a whole car. You can't buy a one-seated car. You could perhaps buy a two-seated car, but but you can't really buy a car for exactly how much you need it for the one seat. There are almost always going to be extra seats in your car. And the question becomes, what do we do with these extra seats? Do we just drive them around places with nobody in them? Probably. But he says that it doesn't have to be that way for the extra seats in our car or all of these other shareable goods that we have. He has this great extended metaphor about slugging, which I love. I think it's such a good idea. Where maybe I've become really, but people. So you can carpool with your coworkers or your neighbors, etc., etc. And usually people carpool with people that they work with, regardless of, obviously, like, that live nearby, even though that's not necessarily the most efficient way to carpool. The very most efficient way to carpool would probably be, like, some complicated math situation where you find out the people living closest to you and the people, like, with the jobs closest, you know, something like that. But we don't do that. Like, I don't talk to my neighbors and say, when do you leave for school? Should we carpool? Because of the transaction cost is just too high. You know, and so he talks about ways to lower the transaction cost. And for carpooling, he talks about slugging in, I think specifically Washington, D.C., I can't remember, but people come to this place, people with seats in their car and people who need seats, and they don't know each other, but they just set this up, and then they just get in each other's cars and drive to work, which is so efficient. And because they... What's that, Talina?
I didn't say anything.
Okay. And it's so efficient, and because they figured out a way to lower the transaction costs. I think that is what we need to do. We need to figure out what the transaction costs are for participating in open education and how we can lower them. So that was kind of my takeaway from this article.
So then the question becomes, what are the major transaction costs? Anyone want to take that?
So the thing that comes to mind for me is the startup. The coming in, you come into OER, and I've felt this. I come in and I'm like, I am so excited. I don't know what to do. And then, like, that's as far as you go. You know, and I think that there are people, I can't be the only one, right, that, like, think this is such a good idea and maybe even have skills that could be useful but don't know where the best place to contribute is, don't know what kind of content they should be contributing to, don't know any of that. Maybe we need to we should put a chapter in our book about that. How to help.
A how-to guide, right? Because you get the emotional investment and you have that connection to it on a very emotional level. It speaks to your heart.
Yeah.
Yes, this is something I can get behind. I believe it. I believe in it. Point me in the right direction. And now what? And then what? And there's really nowhere to go from there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So there's so many repositories, and how do you know which one you should contribute to? Should you contribute to all of them? You know, how do you know what kind of content or whatever it is that you should build that will be the most effective or useful to people? You know, like, has anybody read Zeal Without Knowledge?
No, but I don't think I need to. The title, I think, says it all.
You should. It's awesome. It's nibbly, and it's a great little, I don't remember if it's an article or a talk, but it's great. But it's about how people often, they're like a car with an engine but no steering wheel, you know, and, like, off they go. And that's sort of how I feel. Like, I really want to do something, but I don't know what to do. I have lots of zeal, but not very much knowledge.
So that's the big transaction cost then.
Yeah, I think.
Yep.
Which repository to use, but then I think more importantly, people are pointed to these repositories, but then they don't know what to do with it.
Mm-hmm.
They're just overwhelmed with 10 million objects in there that they could use, but there's no. And if you kind of walk people through it, people would know exactly what to do. Like, you have your lesson plan. Okay, let's go and find this thing and let's embed it into your lesson plan.
So a wizard. Is that what you're saying? Like a wizard of sorts?
Ooh, like a paperclip?
Like a tutorial.
Not the paperclip.
I'm hearing, Christian, I heard you say instructional designer stuff. People who want to create and produce and contribute. And Hiram, I'm hearing you saying user, like end user, maybe creator types of teachers who want to take it and use the stuff that's been created to then pass it on to the students. Am I understanding that accurately?
Absolutely.
So kind of an assembly line, and you're, Christian, I'm hearing you talk about the beginning part of that, the people who want to contribute and create the stuff that then the teachers take it and use it and give it to the students.
Right. Yeah.
Together.
Yeah. And I think we have high transaction costs on both ends. Like, nobody knows what to do, and we're all kind of wandering around in large repositories of learning objects.
So we
nobody's organized. It's chaos, right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So we need some kind of
I'm
guide.
working with teachers, and I know that if they had access to this or they understood how to utilize these tools, they would. But they're like, we just don't know. We just don't know what to do. We don't know how to use this.
Yeah. And there's
Even
no reason for it to be hard. It should be simple.
Right.
Okay, so
Well, even myself.
would they use it if they knew how to? Because I know that that's a huge barrier. Even if they have the knowledge, do they have the time?
Yeah, that's another big issue. They don't have the time.
Well, so I don't think it's reasonable to expect teachers to like rebuild their whole curriculum from the ground up with open things. But I do think it's reasonable for them to say, oh, I really want to teach X, but it's not in my textbook. What should I do? Oh, maybe an open thing would be good. And a little at a time ease into that. But like I was working on a project recently, and it was like the plan, like the goal was to use open source things and adapt them. But it was so hard to adapt them that I ended up just building a new thing. And I was like, and I wonder if teachers are having that similar issue. They're like, I heard about this open thing. It's cool. But they can't find anything about volcanoes, and so they build their own module about volcanoes. And they don't know how to make Creative Commons, so they don't. And it's just,
Yeah, and my teachers who build entire courses end up spending so much time looking through the billions of resources that are out there that after what we tell them is if you can't find a good resource in about 20 minutes, build something yourself because it's not worth looking anymore. The transaction costs of searching the needle in the haystack, build it yourself. And so the searching part of it is very time consuming.
Yeah.
So we're talking about layers and layers and layers of barriers using what's been created out there, which goes back to the curation versus creation. But then that adds to the problem, right? We're adding layer on layer on layer of more creation because the curation is ridiculous, which adds more creation to the problem. I don't know.
Yeah, higher and higher transaction costs.
Right, to have to search through it.
So we've been going for about 20 minutes. Do we want to start kind of winding down? Have any final thoughts?
Let's come up with some solutions. I like the idea of a wizard or a tutorial or a gap analysis. That's one thing that I heard that we could do. For teachers who don't have time, who don't have the authority, because usually it's the districts or the principals who determine what curriculum that you can use. Typically, teachers can't decide, I'm going to toss the textbook and use whatever the heck I want to. That's not usually going to happen. But there's a gap there. This isn't included in my textbook, and I really need to cover this. There's a gap there that they could say, you know what, I'm going to supplement with open source. Here's the easiest, fastest, green lights all the way down Main Street way to do that. That's something we could provide, right?
Yeah. I think so.
So I'm
by
working.
I mean us. I mean somebody other than us. Hey, open universe out there. Somebody make that.
So I was going to say, we're working right now on some open badge stuff, and we're actually looking to invite other people to create badges on our platform. And so what we're doing is we're actually creating a wizard of sorts that as you are creating your badge and uploading your criteria and things like that, it'll ask you questions. And nothing super fancy, but just kind of prompts, if you will, to make people who are adding badges kind of ask the questions amongst themselves. Oh, do we want to do this? Are we following the best practice that this thing is suggesting? And so on. So it could be something as simple as that. You log on to one of these resources, one of these repositories, and it might ask you the question, are you a provider or are you a user? And then you click, and then it kind of steps you through from there to help you narrow down and find the things that you're looking for, or to find the right place to add or the right place to design and contribute.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea.
It's kind of a badge flowchart wizard.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. And it's the kind of thing that could, I don't know a lot about this, but it could learn over time, right? Like the algorithms, you could figure out where people were having problems and put more helps in there. And over time, as people had more time to build this thing, they could add to it and improve it. And because I think with all of these open things, like, back to the transaction cost, you have to keep the transaction cost low for this too. right?
Mhm.
It could be really, really simple in the beginning, and then a little at a time grow.
Certainly.
Yeah.
Any
I
other
think
thought?
that's the direction.
Well, we've solved all the problems of the universe, so.
So I have a question for y'all. So I'm making a list of all the barriers that exist, all the different areas where there could be friction and transaction costs. Let me see if I've got them all. So we have
Okay.
so I have system as the repository or whatever it may be. So finding the right one, learning how to input into that repository, finding the correct stuff that you want to get out of it, knowing how to take it out and incorporate it into your own materials, and then how to remix those materials.
Yeah. And I think maybe on both ends of that, when you're building, when you're remixing or when you're building for the first time, how to license it properly. Which is not very hard, but I think if you've never heard of Creative Commons, then that is hard.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like add that.
Honestly, if you have no idea what copyright and copyleft and open licenses and all of that is, it's like learning a foreign language. And if that's even a possibility for you, it's a lot to wrap your head around at the beginning.
Are there any other friction points that you guys can think of?
Did you have time in there and authority to use open content?
I don't know if I understand what you mean by that.
Well, so teachers can't just make an open textbook and use it. If a district adopts a curriculum, and I'm talking in K-12 spaces, they have to use what the district says they have to use. They might be able to supplement around it, but if all of the history teachers in Alpine School District are using X textbook or at a specific school, they have to use what the school or the district says they have to use. Mm-hmm. So an individual teacher doesn't have the autonomy to just decide what they want to use to teach from. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So the authority. Okay, that makes sense. Yeah.
So I feel like there's sort of maybe design friction points and policy friction points, and that would probably go into the policy friction points.
Yep.
I buy that.
Mm-hmm.
Any other friction points?
Policy friction?
Well, so we theoretically could alleviate a lot of the other friction points. We could the four of us could build a wizard, mostly Dan. Theoretically.
I'm not a programmer. Not a good one, at least.
But as far as like getting teachers the autonomy, that's something that would take legislation or something. Yeah, some sort of policy change with school boards or something.
Well, but that's where remember, this is where the gap analysis came in, that
right.
The purpose of this is to supplement your existing infrastructure, right? We're not trying to recreate an entire curriculum. We
Mm-hmm.
want to show them how to supplement what they already do.
Yeah.
And honestly, I think this is how you start, because once they become comfortable, oh my gosh, look at this amazing thing that I have and that I found, and now I'm comfortable doing it, then they can say, well, look at this in the textbook. There's this other piece that I like better than what's in the textbook. Why don't I just use that instead of I'm just supplementing what's in the textbook. Then it's a step-by-step process. But what we want them to do is just become familiar with what's out there and use it to supplement around. But they're not going to do whole-scale adoption, 3 minutes after being introduced to whatever.
Well, I'm gonna write up this list of barriers, and I'll maybe bring it up tomorrow or talk with David about it and see if he has any more to add, because I think that would be a good starting point to say, here's all the barriers.
Yeah.
What are the key barriers? Because policy, we don't have as much control over that as setting up a system that it's easy to input into the system, or it's easy to know how to remix this stuff.
Right, and that deals with systemic change that I'm not even sure we want to address that, right? We're just trying to, we want to tweak right now We just want to introduce it and get teachers used to supplemental type things. We're not going for systemic overhaul.
Yeah.
So if you want to put all of that in a Google Doc, we can attach it to this video so viewers, when they come along, they can actually see what we have there as well.
Great.
Okay.
Great
I'll
idea.
throw it in a Google Doc.
Great. Well, guys, we're at 30 minutes right now, so I think we should probably wrap it up. But thanks everyone for participating and for talking open economics with us today.